Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. To help us unpack President Trump's meeting with Ukrainian President Zelenskyy and European leaders today, we have an excellent panel of guests joining us now. We have retired U.S. Army Major General Randy Manner. He's also a former Pentagon official. We're also joined by defense policy analyst Frank Gaffney. He's the president of the Institute for the American Future. And also with us is U.S. Marine Corps and Army National Guard veteran John Byrnes. He's currently the strategic director of Concerned Veterans for America. Thank you all so much for joining us on this historic day. Now, it was all smiles today, but many point to the tense few days that led up to this. First, what's your reaction to how today's bilateral and then broader meeting with NATO and EU leaders went? General, starting with you.
I think I'm very optimistic. It's something where when people sit down and talk and there is a worthwhile two-way constructive conversation, it usually results in some better understanding by both parties and hopefully moving towards some kind of an agreement. And I certainly am optimistic that something positive will come out of this show of diplomacy. I'm very pleased that it is happening.
And Frank, your thoughts on how today went?
Well, I think there's a ceremonial quality to it all, and it remains very much to be seen, to my way of thinking, what is, in fact, coming out of all of this, and whether agreements that we're hearing have been reached are real. I remain, frankly, very skeptical of whether the Russians are going to allow the kinds of security guarantees that are now seemingly being presented. We're taking Steve Witkoff's word for this, but let's recall that recently he seemingly got it wrong that the Russians were talking about Ukrainian troops withdrawing when Witkoff took it as Russian troops withdrawing from some of the areas involved here. It's a fluid situation. Whether it turns out to be positive or whether it's just sort of theatrical, I believe is something that's too early to say.
And John, your thoughts on today, optics, and also, compared to the Alaska summit on Friday?
Well, the optics were good. I think the optics proved that the optics weren't as bad as they were reported over the weekend with the meeting with Putin. You're going to find a panel mostly agreeing here. I think the problem is, as Mr. Gaffney said, it's in the details. And can we get Ukraine to agree to something like giving up territory while getting Mr. Putin and Russia to allow U.S. security guarantees? And it's very clear that Russia has felt threatened by the westward movement of NATO. So an Article 5 type guarantee is something that's going to be very, very hard to negotiate. And there's going to have to be a lot of details to make it work out.
And General, digging in there were talks about security guarantees today. What do those need to look like if they should lead to lasting peace for both Europe and also the U.S.? What should we be contributing?
I do completely agree that having Russia accept some type of Article 5 type of proposal, even though the Ukraine would not be part of NATO, is something that really does surprise me. I have been in Ukraine, I've been in Moscow, I've been in Russia, although this was obviously a few years ago when I was on active duty. It is something, however, that it surprises me they will actually agree to it. If we indeed have American boots on the ground in Ukraine, it dramatically changes the equation as well as the stakes, not only for the president, but for the United States as well. I think the fact that the Europeans are united in supporting Ukraine is a terrific, extremely positive action that has taken place over the past year. I am concerned in the same manner that the president has advocated for further contributions, which I do, by the way, very strongly believe in, that nations need to contribute to the common defense. At the same time, it really does remind me of the period in Europe in the late 30s when there was a lot of arming of nations, and for what purpose. The United States, for example, is showing increased military spending, and I have to actually say for what objective, because we are the most powerful military on the planet, and it's just indicative that we need to be very cautious and careful while indeed trying to work out some kind of negotiation with the Ukrainians, with the Russians and the Europeans.
And Frank, how are you viewing this? Are you surprised by the, occurrence or potential looking at these Article 5 type guarantees for Ukraine, which isn't part of NATO?
Yeah, I don't know what to make of it, honestly. I think that it sounds to me as though there are ideas that are being bandied about, but I'm not sure that they're going to materialize. And one of the wild cards in all of this that I think is almost entirely neglected, unfortunately, is the fact that China, which I believe was instrumental in getting this war started, because I think it's part of their efforts to distract us and tie us down, both there and, by the way, in the Middle East as well, is making it pretty clear that they're not keen on having this war over. They want this to continue, I think, and they're not being held to account. Interestingly, the president put secondary sanctions on India, but not on China. If you want leverage on Russia, that would be one way to get it, and might be decisive in terms of agreeing to something on these security guarantees. If the president can sell it to the American people as well, by the way.
That's a good point. I do want to get to China, but first, John, how are you and veterans viewing President Trump today, hinting at potentially putting U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine as a deterrent?
Well, as the other panelists can tell you, the U.S. veterans community can be pretty divided on questions like this. There are strong supporters of doing everything we can to help Ukraine. There's strong supporters like myself of being very, very restrained in what we do. I personally and the veterans that I work with and associate with are very concerned about the idea of putting U.S. boots on the ground there, especially extending a U.S. nuclear umbrella to a country that is historically part of the Russian orbit. They share deep cultural ties, antipathies, but the Russians consider them really part of their greater culture and their greater sphere of influence. And the Ukraine is always going to matter more to Russia than it does to the United States. And extending that, that security guarantee that includes boots on the ground and a nuclear guarantee, that's very, very concerning.
And General, when it comes to ending this war, President Trump said today, if we don't have a trilateral, then the fighting continues. Putin is expecting my call when we're finished with this meeting. How likely are we to see that trilateral summit set up?
I'm very concerned that it will be very difficult to move this very quickly forward. It reminds me again of the British and the French and other nations that, quite frankly, conceded parts of Czechoslovakia to Hitler just prior to World War II. If you recall, the idea was the Czechs were not even at the table. They were not part of it, and the British and the French gave away territory to Germany. I hope that situation is not imposed on the Ukrainians. This is something where the Ukraine must be able to stand up for themselves with the support of Europe and, of course, by the United States. I do share the opinion of the others on this panel that we need to be very cautious about putting American boots on the ground. That is a commitment of the lives of our young soldiers and airmen and other personnel, and it should not be taken lightly. So I do share that we need to think this through thoughtfully, and it will take time to negotiate something that is as complex as this.
And Frank, on that note, President Trump said on Saturday that the best way to end the conflict is by going straight to a peace agreement, as ceasefires often don't hold up. Now, if a ceasefire is agreed upon, what terms would need to be included to ensure it stays permanent and isn't breached by either side? And if it is breached, what then?
Well, Tiffany, I just have to tell you, I don't put any stock in any commitment that Vladimir Putin makes. He is a product of a communist system. He has, I believe, systematically violated previous agreements, as, by the way, have the Chinese, who are the senior partners in this no limits partnership. So I think a ceasefire is at best going to be a period, as in the Middle East, they call it a hudna, where it's used to regroup, to rearm, and to re-engage. And I think that's part of why there's such apprehension on the part of the Ukrainians and their friends in Europe, especially, that it might not be confined to to Ukraine, but perhaps bear a bigger problem for Europe writ large as well.
And General, I want to go to you very quickly because in the past you have helped neutralize chemical weapons in Russia. So given what you know about Russia, How should the U.S. be approaching this? For example, can we believe Putin's promises that the conflict will end if Ukraine gives up land?
I actually do not think that we should trust the present leadership of Russia without extraordinary guarantees. This is something where what we did with the weapons was it was in the best interest of the Russians to eliminate chemical weapons because they were very concerned that some of those weapons could be stolen and used against the Russian people. We obviously had a common denominator that these weapons were extremely dangerous. They were not being maintained, and they were not only at extreme risk for the Russians, but also for the Europeans and also for the United States. Those stories that just a few drops can kill hundreds of people, if it was dispersed correctly, were absolutely true. I believe that in that particular case, the Russians knew because we were literally doing this for them. We had the technology and the money to neutralize their chemical weapons. In this particular case, they believe that part of the Ukraine or all of the Ukraine has historically been part of their nation and they want it back. I also believe that the Russians should not be trusted in this process. I do hope at the same time, it said that, I think it was the chief of staff during World War II had said that the people who feel the pain of war are the soldiers. And we need to always remember that we've got to make these decisions thoughtfully with solid guarantees that are backed up by multiple nations and by economic reasons, economic indicators as well, so that we are not just putting soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in harm's way. I think that's really critical.
And on that note, John, what role do you see the U.S. playing in the immediate but also longer-term future should a peace deal be reached?
Well, again, I think the negotiation part is good. I think the president's doing a fantastic job at keeping parties at the table and continuing the conversation. Again, I'm very opposed to the idea of a nuclear umbrella or U.S. boots on the ground as part of this. At the end, it's true what the general said. You can't trust Vladimir Putin at all. You also can't go to war with him. And there's only 4 options to ending this. It's either Ukraine loses or surrenders. There's a prolonged war or a wider war, or finally there's a negotiated peace. So the negotiated peace is obviously the best outcome for him.
And Frank, I want to go back to you. You mentioned earlier China's role in all of this. So lay out what has been China's role and how is China watching all of this unfold?
Well, Tiffany, I think the circumstantial evidence at the very least is that they greenlighted the war, maybe even instructed it, as part of what I call strategic arson. They're set on expanding their areas of influence and control in the Pacific particularly, and tying us down, tying the Europeans down, tying anybody else who might impede their efforts is part of the game. And I think it applies to the Middle East as well, by the way. When Putin went to Beijing in February of 2022 for the Olympic Games, and they rolled out this no limits partnership, and they said they were going to change the world, I think they had this in mind. And so I think when you look at that, plus what the Chinese have been doing to essentially prop up Putin with their oil purchases, albeit on a discounted basis, and to arm him, and I think probably to arrange for North Korean soldiers to go and fight for him. That's all evidence of what I think is a position indicating not only that they helped get this underway, but they want it to keep going. And that has to be a factor in all of this, and it's seemingly completely missing.
And expanding on that, General, given what Frank Gaffney just laid out, do you think the negotiations today touched on China's aspect? Of course, there's the ongoing trade talks between the U.S. and China, but do you think there is acknowledgement of potentially China's role here?
Well, that is certainly a possibility. I have no evidence of it. It certainly was not mentioned. And I think this was predominantly focused on the Europeans with Ukraine, with the potential of the negotiations with Russia. As of this point, I do agree with the panel members that China plays a significant role. And it's not remember, China will always act in China's interests the same way that Russia will act in its own interests and the way the United States will as well. And we have to step back a second to really try to understand what is important to the Chinese, what's important to Russia, Ukraine, Europeans, as well as the United States. While it's absolutely true that we do not want to have armed conflict, there are also implications of trade policy and economic gains that could be had. And I don't mean necessarily through the selling of arms. It could be just through commerce as well. So we have to look at the larger picture about what are the objectives that China may have on the table that are not being examined. In answer to your question, I really don't think that China or the subject of China played a prominent role in the brief discussions they had today.
And John, on that note, though, what would an end to the Russia-Ukraine conflict mean for China, especially the no-limits partnership between Russia and China, but also how would that change the U.S.-China relationship?
That's going to, again, depend on what the outcome is. The panelists are both right. China has built themselves a client state that has a great supply of oil by supporting Russia and maybe even encouraging them, as said. And they're praying that the outcome includes an Article 5 type security guarantee and even boots on the ground in Ukraine, because that will spread our forces thinner. And we've made it clear socially that it's much more important what's going on in the Pacific with China than what's going on in Europe, where the Europeans are wealthy enough and well-armed enough to really secure their own continent. So I 100% agree. China is laughing up its sleeve and is praying that this just gets prolonged for longer and longer.
Well, John Byrnes, Frank Gaffney, and General Randy Manner, thank you all so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.